Hello, good evening, and welcome to History on Your Doorstep with me, Graham Loveluck-Edwards. In tonight's show, we are celebrating the 619th anniversary, so maybe we should have waited until next year, so it would be 620th, but there we are, the 619th anniversary of Owain Glyndwr's Siege of Coity Castle. And I am delighted to be joined in the studio by my Welsh medieval specialist, our regular guest, Claire Miles. Hello, Claire.
Thank you ever so much for having me back again, Graham.
I cannot put into words how delighted I am. Yes, so fantastic to have you here with your knowledge and a personal link, ladies and gentlemen, which I've deliberately not asked for any details of because I want to be wowed at the same time as you. So here we are talking about Owain Glyndwr. Now, today we're going to look at it from three different segments, as we always do. We're going to start off by talking about the wider picture, what was going on, what was he revolting against, who he was and his background and all that type of thing. Then we're going to focus in on the more local stuff. We're going to be talking about Coity Castle, and then we're going to finish up by talking about his legacy, because he's still very much part of modern day life. We've got a pub named after him in Cardiff. We've got statues of him in City Hall. The nationalists rally behind his flag. There were a fair few of those flags flying at alternative protests on Coronation Day. So, you know, he's still part of the psyche. So we'll be talking about why and what his legacy is, and also what happened to him, because that's a big question mark. So there's a lot to get through. Yeah. We better start, haven't we? So Claire, tell me about who Owain Glyndwr actually was.
So, like you said, many people now know him as a Welsh prince, as a leader of a Welsh revolt. But back in the early days, back in the late 14th century, he was essentially lawyer, landed gentry up in what is now North Powys. He was an educated Welshman serving the English crown.
What was his princely line? Where was he descended from?
Oh, he was descended from multiple princely houses.
Okay.
He was also closely related to the House of Tudor from Penmyddin and Anglesey, so there's a link there as well.
Oh, wow.
So he's a descendant of several royal dynasties. He did have a legitimate claim to the title of Prince of Wales, but he was also a major squire up in North Wales. I think he was one of the most richly, you know, in terms of income, he was one of the biggest landowners, the richest squires in Wales. So he had the money to go with the title and the lineage as well. He was
a bigwig, he was a top dog, he was all of those things. And up until the revolt, certainly, well, let's step back, because the context of history, we had a change of king, didn't we? We had Richard II going out and Henry Bolingbroke coming in. So under Richard II, he was loyal to the king. He was known to the king. They were known to each other, and then things kind of fell apart after Henry IV came to the throne, and in particular a local problem with a local lord. So how did it all spark off? Where did the revolt begin?
Well, historians theorise there's several reasons for the revolt. One of them, like you said, one of the catalysts is a bit of a tussle over land with his neighbour, Reginald de Grey, Baron de Grey, and it all got a bit heated. They sent some nasty letters between one another. In one letter, Owain Glyndwr said he had stolen some horses off Reginald. There's a bit of a screw you type situation, and in reply Reginald says, well, I'm taking you to court and you're going to hang for stealing. It got that bad, but there were many other factors as to why, you know, the time was right for a revolt as well. So not just it wasn't just that land dispute. Like I said, there was a lot of turbulence going on in England and Wales as a whole. Then you mentioned the transfer of power from Richard II to Henry IV. You know, there was a lot of national disturbance going on. Got Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke coming in, and many people presume that it would be quite a smooth transition of power in some ways.
Yeah.
And it should have been the same for Owain as well, because Owain actually served Henry Bolingbroke as a squire in certain battles. So you would think that everything would go to plan.
Well, particularly as Richard II was so unpopular. He was hated by so many people for misrule and things like that, and he was persuaded to step down as king. I mean, persuaded to make it sound like it was a gentle conversation. And imagine there was there were some other tools used to make sure he agreed.
And in terms of the Welsh context, we have to remember, yes, Owain was part of kind of like the English gentry system. He went to London, he'd learned law, he was, he had served various aristocrats at various battles and so forth. He was part of what we'd call the establishment nowadays.
Yeah.
But we have to remember that in Wales, still Welsh people were being denied certain offices, certain privileges, since the 13th century. So even though they were allowed to participate in this sort of activity, they were still seen as a bit of a second-class sort of citizen, and they were often given derogatory nicknames because they couldn't speak English and so forth. So even though we've got this national disturbance going on in terms of Wales, there's still that Welsh resentment almost, the fact that they can't fully participate.
Yeah. And we had no MPs and things like that. So there was a lot of things that made us here in Wales different from the establishment in England. And also, of course, not all of Wales. I mean, we may have our own vision of what Wales is today, but at that time, not all of Wales was the same. Here in Glamorgan, we were a marcher county, so in other words, we were on the border with Wales without technically being in Wales, and this at the time was part of England and had been for some time.
Yeah, and Owain was exactly the same. Because, like in modern day terms, he's about one Suckarth, where his homestead, his where he lived with his wife and family. It's about 1 mile away from the English border. So this identity of Wales v England is a much more nuanced idea back then. It wasn't so binary. You were in Marcher land, you were a mix of the both.
Yeah. And
you lived in this kind of grey area, and that's exactly the same context that Owain would have been operating in as well.
Absolutely. And had his revolt, because in terms of how his revolt began in 1400, it relied a lot on obviously people on his doorstep taking his side and fighting alongside him, and that he was able to get quite a lot of traction doing that. There is an argument that if it had begun here in 1400 in Glamorgan, that it would probably never got off the ground, because by 1400 Glamorgan was quite cosmopolitan, because we'd had the Llywelyn revolt in 1316, and after that things in Glamorgan at the very least, a lot of those segregations had relaxed, and you had Welsh and English families marrying each other, you had Welsh farmers allowed to farm in the Vale, which they hadn't been before, and it was down to Henry IV reinstating all of those differences in response to Glyndwr's rebellion that actually turned a lot of people in Glamorgan against him. Had he not done that, the chances are Glyndwr probably wouldn't have succeeded as much as he did down here. He wouldn't have got off the ground. But because the king had reintroduced all of these measures, it turned an awful lot of people against him. And when we get into the meat of Coity Castle, I'll be revealing who led that siege, and it was an Englishman. It was a chap whose lineage was as English as could be. So, but spoiler alert, that's for later. So there we are. So we got this revolt. That's the spark might have been a quarrel with a neighbour, but it certainly grew arms and legs, and it represented so many different things that was going on. There were religious contexts to it, because in one of his letters to the King of France, he spoke about Canterbury being loyal to the Pope in Rome, but this was the peculiar time when we had two popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, and of course he wrote to the king saying that he would favour the Church of St. David being loyal to Avignon as a way of trying to win him over. We also have that context with France, because England was in the 100-Year War with France at the time. So Glyndwr was allying himself to Charles VI in France as another enemy to England. And then in addition to that, you've got the subcontext of that Richard II thing. And all of those people who, like the Percys of Northumbria, like the widow of Thomas Despenser, what's her name? Her name was Constance. She was the Duchess of Gloucester. She was related to the king, but she sided with Glyndwr as well. So you've got so many subplots going on. It was just a really, really turbulent time with a lot of people grabbing at what they could.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get into it, but I think another thing that Owain Glyndwr did really well was like you said, the alliances, not just the marrying of the children, but the alliances. I'm sure we'll get onto the tripartite indenture.
Yes.
He as well as being a very good military strategist, he's obviously had a bit of a strategic brain in there as well.
Yeah, incredible. And to a lot of people, believed to be a wizard as well, which is also, strategically speaking, quite a useful thing to have on your side. Do we know where that originates from?
Oh, well, I've got several theories about this.
Oh, okay.
One of them, which I won't get into because I think it will relate to what we're going to talk about at the end of the show about his demise. But also there's the whole Mab Darogan, son of prophecy kind of a theme that we have in Welsh history and Welsh literature. So I think it's very interesting to see that the early letters that he wrote are very much kind of rooted. That's the point of view that he's coming from. That when he writes his early letters, when he's trying to gain support, is that he's, I don't want to say the chosen one. That's probably the terminology that we use now. But he kind of latched on to that ancient Britain identity in his early letters. So I think he kind of used it to his own advantage a little bit.
Drew. And of course there was also this thing where the English believed he could control the weather because of the storms that kept occurring, which put them at disadvantages during battles. Which is
it's called the Welsh weather.
I was going to say it is quite cool if your enemy thinks that you can control the weather. He also had a lot of respect from his enemies. I mean, I was just looking at how Shakespeare described him, because obviously he was a character in Henry IV Part 1, and Shakespeare obviously was English and took the English point of view. So it wasn't like he liked him and liked what he stood for, but he definitely respected him. Because this is what he had to say about him. This is supposedly Owain Glyndwr speaking now. At my birth, the front of heaven was full of fiery shapes. These signs have marked me extraordinary, and all the courses of my life do show I am not in the role of common men. Now, those are words that it definitely suggest that he thinks that this is quite an extraordinary person, somebody who was set aside.
But did you know that Shakespeare's grandmother, one of them, was Welsh?
Get out of here.
I wonder if that's where he got it from.
Do you think there's a little bit of being on the side? Okay, so we've got a little bit of a picture of who Glyndwr was. We know something about his lineage, his descendants from the princes of Powys and Ceredigion and other places as well. We know something about what sparked the revolt. We know the revolt is not as simple as just Welsh versus English. There were lots of things coming together. It was a really turbulent time. There were a lot of famines happening at this time, plagues coming in and out and killing people. So all of these things were all playing into a general feeling of dissatisfaction, which he was able to tap into. And that led to a revolt. And by 1403, pretty much the whole of Wales was involved in one way or another. And that brings us to our doorstep. May 1404, 619 years ago, was when Owain Glyndwr's siege of Coity Castle began. It's interesting to note, the importance of when it began, because it was the longest siege of the entire conflict. It lasted nearly 2 years. And part of the reason why it lasted so long was because Glyndwr's forces weren't necessarily that well equipped to do sieges. They didn't have any siege engines, they didn't have catapults or battering rams or platforms or trebuchets, only these wonderful things that were in use in those days. So let's talk about how that actually came about. Now, in terms of timelines and in terms of the landscape in this area at the time, let's bring that up to date. So we're talking about 1404. Now, at that point, Glyndwr had been fighting predominantly in Monmouthshire. He'd been fighting in the town of Monmouth and also in Abergavenny, and he was starting to move west. At the time the siege started in Coity Castle, it wasn't actually started by him. Spoiler alert. It wasn't started by him. It was started by local people. Now, you would have heard me say a moment ago that at this point in history, Glamorgan was quite cosmopolitan. The differences between the English and Welsh had been watered down quite a lot here. And the end result was you had families where maybe the father was English, but the mother was Welsh, and the children therefore were a bit of each. So it really was quite a complicated thing to do, to try and segregate everybody, because we've been at it, ladies and gentlemen. We've been procreating and creating children. It wasn't that straightforward a thing to do. So the person that we believe who started the siege on Coity Castle was a chap called John Fleming, who was from Cowbridge. And the village of Flemingston is named after that family. And as those of you who've read my books will know, when I talk about place name origins, if it's got a ton at the end, that usually means it's an English settlement, because ton is a Saxon word. So yeah, the Flemings were English, although the name suggests at some point they were probably from the Low Countries. But yeah, so it wasn't started by Glyndwr himself. Glyndwr was over in Cardiff trying to burn that to the ground when the siege began in Coity. And Fleming wasn't the only English, who you might consider to be English combatant on the Glyndwr team. Another family, and this I find absolutely remarkable, the Turbervilles. Now, the Turbervilles are an Anglo-Norman family. They came over with Fitzhamon in 1090 when they invaded Morgannwg, and they had been the residents of Coity Castle. Coity Castle was their ancestral home. And in 1316, during the Llywelyn-Bren uprising, it was against Payne de Turberville of Coity that the revolt happened, because Llywelyn-Bren said he was treating his people too cruelly.
Now, this is where this story goes absolutely bat crazy. If you go to the church in St. Athan to visit the tomb of the Berkerolles family, you'll find the tomb of the inhabitant of Coity Castle during the time of the siege, Sir Lawrence Berkerolles. You'll find the tomb of his parents, Roger and Catherine Berkerolles. And at the foot of their tomb, you've got all of the different coats of arms that the family had married into. And amongst those arms, you will find one for Iestyn ap Cwrgan. So straight away, we are feeding into what I was saying earlier about how Welsh nobility and English nobility had intermarried. So you've got that in there. But that is not the weirdest thing, ladies and gentlemen. You will also see the coat of arms of the Turbervilles, because Sir Lawrence Berkerolles' own mother was born Catherine Turberville. And it is from her line that he ended up inheriting Coity Castle. So there is a possibility that the reason why members of the Turberville family were fighting on the side of Glyndwr was because they believed in his vision of an independent Wales, or, and this is possibly more likely, when Berkerolles inherited Coity Castle, there was an almighty stink and inheritance dispute where many members of the Turberville family were absolutely outraged that the castle had passed out of the Turberville family, having been in it since the thing was a motte and bailey back in the beginning of the 12th century. So it's possible that it maybe wasn't patriotic Welshness, it was more the reenactment of a very bitter inheritance dispute at play here.
The Berkerolles had lots of estates. They also had estates in St Athan and other parts of Glamorgan, other parts of Wales, and also in Somerset. So when the siege began, Lawrence Berkerolles had to try and get supplies to come in to keep them going, because this siege, as I said, lasted nearly 2 years. And the way he was doing it was he was getting supplies from his estates in Somerset, shipped across the Bristol Channel to Ogmore Castle.
Yep.
Ogmore Castle at the time was owned by King Henry IV, because it had passed through the Chaworth line, who were his forebears. So he had inherited that castle. It was his castle. So the stuff was unloaded at Ogmore, then carried across land to get into Coity Castle, which is why Ogmore ended up in ruins, because the rebels kept trying to hit Ogmore Castle to stop this from happening, to stop the supply line getting through to Coity. The Berkerolles themselves were actually in residence at the castle. They stayed throughout the whole 2-year period. They never left, and put up a pretty spirited defence of the castle. And there are scars of this happening. So to the north of the castle, one of the things that people who were trying to sack the castle recognised was that the southern defences were very, very strong. The northern defences not so much. So if you go between Coity Castle and the church, there's a little footpath. If you walk up that footpath, it takes you to a sort of hill, and just behind the lip of that hill, there are still to this day trenches, and those are the trenches that were dug out by Glyndwr's forces who were besieging Coity Castle. They're a bit overgrown.
I'm going to have to go back and have a look now.
You've got to. They are there, just to the north of the castle. So, we've got Coity Castle under siege on behalf of Glyndwr. Once Glyndwr had burned Cardiff to the ground, he came and joined the party, and why wouldn't he? You might be wondering, why was Coity so significant? Why was it worthwhile, this 2-year siege, which was unequalled by anything else that happened during this entire revolt? It's because the principal arterial route through South Wales, the old Roman road, the Via Julia Maritima, runs through the Coity estate. So whoever holds Coity holds the flow of traffic east to west across South Wales. So strategically, tremendously important. And that was the main reason why they were so determined to try and get it. Now, obviously, when this was going on, the king didn't just go, oh, well, never mind. There was obviously steps taken to try and bring this siege to an end. And in October 1404, there was a parliamentary debate entitled The Rescue of Coity. And the people who were leading this debate were the MPs for Herefordshire, because at the time, we said earlier, Wales didn't have any MPs. So these are the ones who were closest at hand. And it was agreed that a defence force would be put together, that Prince Hal himself, the future Henry V, would lead it, and various parties were asked to cough up. Now, this is the wonderful thing about history. So much contemporary history is just ledgers and accounts. It's not stories at all. It's who paid for what, who owned what. So we've got on record that money contributed towards the rescue of Coity. The City of London Corporation agreed to lend the king £733, which is very noble of them. Have a guess how much the bishops of the Church of England agreed. Bear in mind, the Church of England at this point is not a Protestant, it's all of the churches in England that were loyal to the Pope at the time.
Oh, not...
I'll put you... It was £2.
Oh, my Lord.
It was £2. So between all of the bishops across the whole of England, they went, yes, we need to defend Coity at all costs, but not more than
not that
£2.
much.
£2.
Not that much.
And by the way, we want that £2 back afterwards. So maybe their heart wasn't in it. But yeah, so there we go. So in the end, they managed to raise an army on the 13th of November, an army of 2,500 men-at-arms, archers and knights, led by Prince Hal, left Hereford and moved into Wales to try and, first of all, to retake Cardiff, which they did very successfully. They were able to take Cardiff back. But they could not shift the siege at Coity, and they stuck it out for a fair old while. They didn't leave for a year, so they were there for a long time. During that period, Glyndwr was reinforced because in 1405 the French navy arrived in Tenby and Haverfordwest, and they helped retake Carmarthen for Glyndwr. And they also sent men further east, so you had French troops assisting, and then it all started to kind of unwind after that. 1406, a lot of his allies started to desert him, and the siege had been going on, as I say, for the best part of 2 years. And in the end, the strategy of just give up and go home seemed to beset Glyndwr's side as well. So they all disappeared. The castles were left in ruins. Coity was, and I said, going back to what I said earlier about accounts. So we know Coity was destroyed because Lawrence Berkerolles, who lived at Coity, he died in 1411, and he had no sons. So his estate had to be valued so that it could be apportioned between any relatives that were left, 2 sisters predominantly. And Coity Castle was valued at 84 marks. Now, a mark was 2/3 of a pound, so that's 56 quid. So it was in a really shabby state. Ogmore was destroyed, and because it was owned by the king and the king didn't live there, he didn't do anything about it. So he just left it destroyed. Ewenny Priory was also left in a very poor state because the fortifications there had housed English troops, so that was also sacked. And they were given Llangennydd Priory in Gower as compensation, so they could raise the money to rebuild the Priory at Ewenny. Now this raises something, talking about Ewenny, which is I can't get my head around why this should be. Prior to the dissolution of the monasteries, all history was captured by monks pretty much. Every major monastery had a scribing room. They had writers who would keep journals and chronicles and things like that. We in Glamorgan had the monasteries in Neath, Margam, Ewenny, Llancarvan, Llantut Major, Llanduff, all of these massive institutions, all of which had scribes and writing rooms and chroniclers. Not a word from any of them on this conflict. All the documents that were written in this period have disappeared without a trace. Nobody knows what happened to them. So we've got no local contemporary account of this siege. All of the information we have on this siege comes from people like Adam of Usk, who described himself as being on the English side. It's mentioned obviously in Parliament because of the raising of the funds to go and rescue Coity. So it's mentioned in other places, but it's not. There's nothing local about it, which is absolutely extraordinary.
And it's really sad as well.
It is tremendously sad. Because it was such a major big deal, and you know the after effect of it was we had a royal household in ruins, we had a monastery in ruins, we'd just had a 2-year siege, and you'd have thought there was a fair amount, and the siege was led by a local man. So what happened to John Fleming? We don't know. It's not. We have no idea. Did they just say, "Oh well, never mind, don't do it again," or did he get killed? What happened to John Fleming? We don't know. Yeah, very strange, very sad. So, yeah, that was the predominant one that happened in this area. We've also got a really dodgy one.
Okay, I want to hear more about this one.
So, I must admit, up until I started researching for this show, I was on the side of believing the dodgy one might be true.
Okay.
Having looked at the timelines around this, I've now come to the conclusion it might not be true. But I'm going to tell you about it anyway, because that's the kind of guy I am. So I'm looking at a fantastic book that's available in all good bookshops called Legend and Folklore of Bridgend and Vale. I can't remember who wrote it. But there is an entry in here about the Battle of Stalling Down.
Okay.
Now, Stalling Down, just in case you don't know, is just outside Cowbridge. So you've got the television mast at St Hilary, and then you've got a large area of common land where the old Roman road goes across it, and then it drops down into Cowbridge. That is Stalling Down. So, in 1403, Owain Glyndwr was in Carmarthen, where word reached him that the English knew of his presence and were amassing a huge army to march west across Glamorgan to annihilate him and his forces. He sent his army east to meet the English, and the place they met was near Cowbridge. Glyndwr's army was led by several prominent Welsh lords, Rhys Gethin and Cadwagan, Lord of Glynrhondda. In some accounts, Glyndwr himself was there as well, to lead from the front. His forces are also supposed to have been supported by legions from the French army, who were happy to back anyone looking to undermine the King of England. The battle lasted for 18 hours, with blood fetlock deep on the horses that survived the battle. At the end of it, the English were soundly beaten and retreated along the Antonine road to Cardiff, hotly pursued by Glyndwr's forces. The English retreat was confounded still further by the most atrocious weather conditions, most likely leading to further losses. References to thunderstorms and flooding across Monmouthshire are said to have drowned many retreating Englishmen. So, that's the legend. Now, the reason why we tread carefully around this legend is because there is absolutely no mention in R.R. Davies's Revolt of Owain Glyndwr, which is probably the main authority on what happened to Owain Glyndwr. It's also approached with caution because it was recorded by a chap called Iolo Morgannwg.
Oh.
And if you tuned into our last show, then he had his moments. That's all I'm going to say, because he can divide a room. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it definitely happened. And also the story is absolutely packed with sort of Iolo type references. The way he describes the storm and things like that. And storms quite often in Celtic mythology, because the god of storms is normally the defender of the nation as well. So we've got a lot of different things which are all playing in there. So yeah, I always was of the opinion that the Battle of Stalling Down probably did happen on account of a few things. One, the hill that Stalling Down is on is called Bryn Owen. So, that's got some credibility. We've also got some archaeological evidence. And that is, in 1896, the church at Llanblethian, which is only 3 miles away from Stalling Down, had its floor excavated in preparation for building works. Under the floor they found a stone staircase, clearly leading to a crypt that, as far as they could work out at the time, was not detailed in any of the church records. Inside they found the skeletons of over 300 men, piled high, without coffins. There's no plaque or anything like that. On closer examination of the records, they discovered a reference to a crypt, which was described thus: the burial place of the Sweeting family before the war with Owain Glyndwr.
Oh.
So there is some evidence to support that the battle
something happened.
That something happened. Whether it actually was as described by Iolo, who knows? It could be, but we will never know for sure. Now, when he was trying to get support from his rebellion, one of the things he did was write to King Charles VI of France. He wrote 2 letters, one particularly long, in which he outlined what his main problem was. And then he went on to talk about what his potential solution was. I love the way he describes what his problem was. I'm just going to read now, I'm going to quote from the letter. So you have deemed it worthy to learn how my nation, for many years now elapsed, has been oppressed by the fury of the barbarous Saxons, whence because they had government over us, it seemed reasonable with them to trample over us. So he wasn't holding back. He was cross. He was jolly cross at this point. What were his plans beyond simply kicking the English out of Wales? What else did he have up his sleeve?
Well, we're quite lucky in that we've actually got a bit of evidence, a bit of contemporary evidence about what his plans were for Wales. Mm-hmm. So one of them was Ewenny proclaimed them at a national parliament that was held in Machynlleth, the ancient capital of Wales. Yes. And this is where I can read, because this is my old neck of the woods. He wanted to reinstate the ancient laws of Hywel Dda. Yeah. That was number 1. He wanted to establish an independent Welsh church.
Right.
You've already talked about the Pope at Avignon and so forth.
With allegiance to Benedict of Avignon, not Gregory of Rome.
He wanted Wales to be a great learned nation. He wanted to establish 2 universities. Yeah. And he also wanted to encourage the use of Welsh, like have Welsh speakers hold public office, which is quite similar to some policies that we have today when you think about it. So he did have some really big aspirations for the country, but it's not just the aspirations. It was the fact that, like you said, he wrote to France, he wrote to Charles VI. Charles VI obviously recognised him as a fellow leader, and he sent support in the form of armies. And also there were other countries that recognised Owain's claim to the title Prince of Wales, like the Scottish and the Breton envoys as well. So it's not just the fact that he had aspirations, it's the fact that on the international scale, Wales was, to a certain extent, a recognised independent nation for a couple of years.
And didn't he want to push outside Wales as well?
Yes, and this is where the Triparteid Indenture comes in. Try saying that when you've had a few drinks. So his idea, he basically teamed up with the Percys, Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, another one that you can't say very quickly, and the Mortimers, Edmund Mortimer, and they basically devised a plan. So if they were successful, they would divide England and Wales into three, hence the Tripartite Indenture. And they'd each have their own little bit to rule over. And I find the alliances with both, like you said before, the alliances with both those people are really interesting because, other side of the border, but, people that you wouldn't necessarily expect to side with Owain Glyndwr. But Edmund Mortimer I find really, really interesting because he got married to one of Owain Glyndwr's daughters, and his nephew was a potential claimant to the English throne. So you can't get much closer to the English crown and the English establishment than that. But yet, at the same time, Edmund Mortimer was like, no, I'm going to put my lot in with Owain Glyndwr, with my father-in-law.
Well, Constance Despencer was also related to the English king, and she was on the side of Glyndwr. So it's quite remarkable how close to the English throne his support was.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And like I said before, I think the allyship, more you get into his family tree, the sons and the daughters he married off into marcher lordships and prominent families. He really got his fingers into those Marcher family trees and tied people in that way.
Well, we talked about the MPs of Hereford earlier. I mean, and his daughter married into that family. I can't remember which family it was. Who were the lords of Hereford? Can you remember?
Two of his daughters married prominent Herefordshire families. One of them, Janet, married into the Crofts, de Croft Castle. They were big. That's the one I was thinking. They were big royal servants. And then the other one, Alice, she married into the family. You'll probably recognise the name, Scudamore. Yes. In North Herefordshire. So they've definitely some links in the marches there.
Yeah. So this sort of brings us to what happened after his revolt had, I mean, by all accounts, fizzled out. I mean, there was no landmark battle at which he was defeated, and it was sort of lost momentum as allies started to leave him. And the lack of contemporary record of what happened next is, I mean, I've already mentioned about there's nothing locally, but it just seems like nationally, whatever happened next seems to have just vanished off the face of the earth, which is plenty of ammunition for some good old conspiracy theories. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to write in with your conspiracy theories, please send them to British Airways, Ingram Drive, Greenwich. So we've got some very interesting what happened next. So I'll start off. Can I start off with mine? Because mine relates to a chap called Jack of Kent. Have you heard of this one?
I have heard of Jack of Kent.
Right, okay. So Jack of Kent was the chaplain to the Scudamores, who we just spoke about, in 1412. And a lot of people believe that Jack of Kent was not a chaplain, but was, in fact, a Glyndwr living out his final years in hiding within shot of his of one of his daughters. So that's one of the theories. What other theories have we got?
Like you, I've heard the theories that he escaped to the marches and he lived out his days near one of his daughters, because two of his daughters lived quite close together. But in terms of contemporary sources, this is what we've got in terms of contemporary sources. This is from the Chronicle of Owain Glyndwr, which was written 1422, but as it exists today, we find it in a 16th century manuscript up in the National Library in Aberystwyth, and it says 1415, Owain disappeared on the feast of St Matthew, apparently that's about the 20th of September, in harvest time autumn, From then on, his disappearance was not known. A great many say he died. The bards say he didn't.
Ooh. Wow. That's doesn't that mean there's going to be a season 2 normally? That means he's coming back, only this time it's personal.
This time it's personal.
I've got a couple of others.
I've got a couple of others too.
Go on. Let me fire this one, because this is quite a cool one. This is a lovely bit of... There's a very old legend which has been retold about King Arthur being buried in a cavern in the Neath Valley, sleeping with his archers and his men at arms, and that one day when Wales is in peril, they will wake up and fight. So there is a very similar legend to that, where it is Owain Glyndwr who is in the cave sleeping with his men at arms, but on the banks of the Gironde, which is near Bordeaux. It's in southwest France. I know. What?
I know, but if you're going to escape to anywhere, would you? You could escape to southwest France.
Somewhere, where there's wine and sunshine and rugby. To be fair, Bordeaux bagels. Anyway, yes. Okay. Next theory.
Well, before I dive into my theory, I'm going to give you my tenuous familial link.
Oh, let's have it. I haven't got a jingle ready.
Please tell me if it's too tenuous, Graham. But I'm chuffed with this link. So it's a bit of a additional tangential fact, but I think you'll find it interesting, and it leads on to my theory about where Owain Glyndwr may be buried. So there's obviously a lot of material out there about Owain Glyndwr, his family, his children. We know that one of his daughters and his grandchildren, his wife, they ended up in the Tower of London, and that's where they died. Mm-hmm. But Glyndwr also had 4 illegitimate children, which he recognised, including 2 daughters. One of which is called Gwenllian.
Yes.
She married a gentleman called Philip ap Rhys, and they lived in a place called Cenarth in Powys. I know. And we know this because several of the medieval Welsh poets, including Owain Glyndwr's favourite, Lewis Glencothi, wrote praise poetry about them, and she comes across as a very formidable, well-known, well-respected woman. Cenarth was a small township in mid-Powys. Mm-hmm. And that is where I'm from. My family owned Cenarth Hill.
No way!
Yes.
So can you trace some lineage?
Well, I can trace my lineage. I'm very lucky. My family, one line of my family, has lived in the same valley since, we know on paper, since at least the 1400s.
Right.
So it's the same sort of time.
Whoa.
And the house, their homestead, their estate, the house, that original cruck-framed medieval building, it's still there encased inside an older long, traditional Welsh longhouse now. So that's still there. They literally would have been neighbours.
Whoa.
So if they didn't intermarry or anything, I'm hoping they at least had a friendly chat.
I was going to say, there's no way they could not. Surely, living in those close quarters for 400 years.
Yeah, and they were similar social standing as well. So that's my personal link.
I love that.
To Owain Glyndwr.
See, I'm so glad I didn't ask about it earlier now, because you did get a genuine wow out of me. I was very impressed by that.
But it comes on to my theory about where Owain Glyndwr, where he may be.
Yes.
It's not really my theory, it's that other people have suggested it as well, but where I come from originally, where Cenarth is, it's very close to the ancient Cistercian Abbey of Abercrombie.
Right, okay.
It's right up in the mountains, and it's also the place where Llywelyn ap Griffith, the last Prince of Wales, so it's where he's buried. And also, it would have been close to his daughter, so I think he might be buried there, because he would have been close to his daughter, but at the same time, it wouldn't have been an obvious place for him to be buried, because during his revolt, he actually attacked Abercrombie early on. It was linked with the Mortimer family before he got into an alliance with them, so he actually went at the building pretty hard and caused some damage. So there's a romantic part of me that thinks he might be buried in the Welsh hills up there.
Oh, I love that for so many reasons. But I am going to hit you with one more possibility.
Okay.
Because it's a local one. Where's my jingle?
It's a tenuous local link.
Insert jingle here.
Insert jingle here. So, obviously you know the famous Castell Coch in Tongwyn Lice.
Oh, yes.
Just past Cardiff. Right? That's not the only Castell Coch in South Wales. To be fair, the other one isn't really a castell. It's more of a sort of manor house, but there we are. So we've got a place Now, near Welsh St Donat's, Hensol, that sort of area, there's a lot of woodland around there. And part of it covers a hill called Mynydd Coch. And there's a large area of forestry on Mynydd Coch known as Coed y Marcog, which is Knight's Wood. And the reason why it's called Knight's Wood is because it takes its name from a mysterious hermit who lived there around 1412, who gave his name as Sean Goodfellow and his occupation as miner. However, it was abundantly clear to people in the area that this was no ordinary miner. He had a swagger about him that suggested he was better bred. He didn't really mix with the locals, but was frequently seen receiving visits from knights and nobility from outside of the area. When he died, he was buried under the Sanctus Spell in Welsh St Donat's Church. Now, I'm going to mention his name again. Iolo Morgannwg is convinced that Sean Goodfellow, the miner, was actually Glyndwr living out his final days here in the Vale of Glamorgan. So there we are. That's my tenuous local link. And I mean, it could have been any number of displaced locals at that nobles at that time. It wasn't that uncommon for people to fall out of favour, as we've just heard. You know, people change their allegiances all the time. So that kind of brings us to where we are today with Glyndwr. Now, he gets reinvented a lot to represent different things to different people. He is now the hero, well, I suppose, as he always has been, of the Welsh nationalists, the people who want Wales to be independent, because here is the blueprint of somebody who tried to do it in 1400. How accurate do you think the modern representations of Glyndwr are to who he was and what he was actually trying to do?
Oh, it's not so much the representation. I think he's become such a figurehead for so many things, like you said. I just think that people don't understand the whole nuance about actually where did this rebellion really come from?
Yeah.
Why was it so successful? What really happened? It's a lot more complicated than that. He's become, like you said, he's become a figurehead with all this mystery around him, the legends that he might come back from his cave one day, and I don't think people fully appreciate the context that he operated in, really.
Yeah, and I think the marvellous thing about it was his vision. I mean, here was a time when people were struggling to find strong leaders. We'd had a string of weak kings who hadn't really done much or had come to succession under dubious circumstances. We had a lot of people dying of plagues and famines and things like that, and he definitely came across as a strong leader with vision, with the ability to galvanise support from some really pretty disparate groups, including the King of France, and who was able to stand on the world stage. And I think he was undoubtedly a great leader of his time, and people from all quarters, including Shakespeare several centuries afterwards, could see. And I would like to finish by quoting the Bard, if that's okay, talking about this is how Shakespeare represented Glyndwr, talking about his relationship with Henry IV. 3 times hath Henry Bolingbroke made head against my power, thrice from the Wye and sandy bottom 7 have I sent him, bootless, home and weather-beaten back. So there we go.
Love it.
Let's leave it there. Claire, it's been an absolute delight to talk to you about Owain Glyndwr today. I hope to see you again soon. And in the meantime, to both of my listeners, I'd like to say thank you very much and goodbye.